morning, YouTube. Metalhead Weatherman here. Hopefully, you guys are doing well. Okay, so there's a lot to cover in this one. This video has been interesting to say the least. The last couple of days have been interesting. I'm going to start out with the tropics here because I'm kind of pinched on time, but essentially, what we have right now is Tropical Storm Brett over here making its way towards the Leeward Islands. Should be making impact over here later today. Then Tropical Depression 4 has now developed here. And this will be at first riding on the coattails of Brett and then deviating off here. Let's go ahead and look at the cone right now. This is where Brett's current location is. Brett is moving at about 15 miles an hour and has maximum sustained winds of 70. It could briefly reach hurricane status before maybe weakening back to a tropical storm. There's a good chance it'll probably stay at 70, but I wouldn't be surprised if it briefly made hurricane. But this is expected to go through the Leeward Islands, and then eventually looks to be heading dead west right now. I think the wind shear is a little bit too strong over here towards the Gulf and parts of the Northern Caribbean. Since that's going to be the case here, I'm thinking this will probably move dead west right towards Nicaragua and Honduras maybe. Does not seem like the waters are really warm here, thankfully, so we may not see this strengthen into a hurricane. We'll have to see how things play out, but most of the warmest water is over here towards the Gulf, but with the added wind shear over here, it's not going to bode well for Brett if it were to even go this far, but we'll have to wait and see what happens here. Steering current mainly, the prevailing winds really seem to be more to the west, so look out Honduras and Nicaragua over the next 5 to 7 days. Let's go ahead and switch over to Tropical Depression 4 here. Notice the track has changed with this one. At first it starts out following Brett, but then eventually the wind current ends up steering it out into the open Atlantic here. For the most part, keeping it away from land. I don't think the Leeward Islands or any of the Antilles will be impacted by this storm, but it is still something to keep an eye on. This does look like it will make tropical storm status, so the next name in line will be Cindy. So we will be keeping an eye on Cindy, or soon to be Cindy, throughout the course of the week as it heads out to sea. More than likely, this storm will probably dissipate, but maybe could be an extratropical entity and become a factor for the southeast. But it's pretty far down the line to be able to tell whether or not that will be the case. So that's what we have going on right now in the tropics. Take a look at the severe weather thing. 4 days of slight risk with potential for some of these days to even be upgraded. So we'll have to wait and see how things develop here. But for now, we're going to focus on today's slight risk, and then we'll probably go on from that point and take a look down the line here. I'm trying to get my mouse to work. Oh, my battery's about to die. So if you hear a little bit more loud click, I'm having used the mouse pad on my laptop here. But this is the slight risk for today. And a lot of the same areas that were impacted with severe weather yesterday are unfortunately in the line of fire again today. Thankfully, areas not too far. Thankfully, Lubbock isn't quite under the gun like it was yesterday. So over towards Matador, we only have a marginal risk. Unfortunately, it's still marginal. But the tornado threat mainly looks to be isolated more so towards New Mexico today. Very familiar territory for me. And then also we have to look at the 2% area towards Cheyenne, Denver, and Pueblo. Also, let's keep in mind that there's also a 2% area across the Atlantic coast here, especially even heading into mid-Atlantic. Not expecting a lot to come out of that, but we've had some days that have really overperformed with even a no-tour risk, so a 2% has to be watched very closely as well. Wind threat is most significant, of course, towards New Mexico. That's where I think the best setup for the low-level jet and other parameters are set into place. And then, of course, the slight risk spreads all the way into Cheyenne, into Pueblo. And even we can't discount anyone in the marginal risk here. So Abilene, Waco, Dallas, Austin, Houston, Fort Stockton, many other places. We're going to have to keep an eye on you, even heading into parts of Kansas and Nebraska, Oklahoma as well. Wind is going to be the main threat with this marginal risk as well over here. I think we're more likely to see damaging winds than anything else, but not to be discounted that we can't see that stretch from not Fort Myers, but from the I-95 corridor through Melbourne, Orlando, Jacksonville, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, even all the way into Virginia Beach here. Hail threat is mostly going to be with this storm system here, encompassing all the slight risk, including a hatch risk. There could be some pretty big hail tonight, so we may go live for this one. Then over towards Orlando and Melbourne, we do have a little bit of a hail threat over here. A little bit more in the way of Florida Magic. I'm not even going to speculate on what the potential sizes of that could be, but we've had plenty of overperforming days in Florida this year, so just be on guard. That being said, let's go ahead and start taking a look at the models here. Mainly going to be having an extra emphasis more so on the Midwest today, towards the high plains. Down the line here, we'll probably see the low-level jets starting to pick up here. Not too much has changed with parameters, but not a whole lot going on towards the northern end here. It's really more so towards New Mexico where I would be more concerned. But with this right here, this is a great example of what I'm seeing here. By the time the low-level jet really gets set up around this region, it's pretty strong cap in place. The window for storms is pretty much closed at this point. So this is something that we won't have to worry about too much. That being said, let's go ahead and work our way more so towards the southern end of the severe threat here. By this point, it's pretty much a similar deal, albeit the cap does look like it breaks. It's a little bit better held together. There still seems like there's a lot of convective inhibition here, but nonetheless, though, and this might be on the backside of these storms, still plenty of instability from what I see here. The D-Cape is very impressive, and then even getting hail analogs long after the storms are probably exiting out of Oklahoma here. I don't expect this to be a widespread event as of right now. Of course, things could change easily, but we're going to switch over and get a better view of the southern or south central plains. But as we go towards later into the evening, low-level jet does kind of pick up, but again, it's the timing that's key here, and we don't have a lot going with that there. See, that's another good example. You get hail analogs, you get weak supercell analogs, but nothing that's incredible here. This is going to be a setup that's really struggles to produce severe weather at this current time. Then again, I didn't expect what happened in Texas the other night, or last night, to happen, but it did, so something to keep an eye on again. Like I said, parameters with this setup today aren't the most impressive. I may go live just for the hail threat, but that's about it. As far as tornadic activity is concerned, it should stay kind of low. I'm not super confident in the setup, I'll put it that way. Storms could fire also earlier in the day too. That's also another thing to keep in mind. But here's a better look at a severe setup here. Here's a good sounding. Well, looks more so like a severe setup, not a tornadic type of setup. There's no cap here, which is pretty reassuring, but supercell analogs are pretty low. D-Cape is something to keep an eye on, though, because it is near 1,000 joules. That's usually the magic number for damaging wind potential. Usually there's pretty high confidence at that point. I do expect them to ramp up just a little bit as we head later into the evening here, especially with this moisture return we're getting. And here's a TOR sounding for you guys. Again, though, look at the hodiograph. Not too much to go off of here with the sounding, so to speak. Even the helicity doesn't look impressive at 84 meters squared per second squared. But other parameters are pretty sufficient, especially Cape. It's going to be very unstable around here, but look at this. This is one thing I want you to take note of, is the hail analogs here. Some of them even getting up to about 4.5 inches. So that plus the D-Cape being at 1,400, that would make for some pretty impressive damaging wind potential there. So just because there's no tornadoes, it doesn't mean that the setup isn't dangerous. But that being said here, we'll keep things moving from this point. The threat really seems like it starts to diminish as we get towards 03Z here. But by that point, I think the worst of things should be over. Oh, I didn't want to click that. So here we are now looking at the south central plains. Moisture return isn't really impressive even with this region over here. Like I said, there's a lot of fail parameters with this setup here. We'll click a sounding here and see what happens, but while the kinematics are slightly more favorable, the issue becomes the cap. I think that the cap's going to come into play a little earlier into the evening before those low-level winds really start to ramp up. That low-level jet really gets to crank. So it would be around 04Z where things would start to ramp up. And then on top of that, the moisture return just doesn't really seem like it gets there in time. I mean, you still got those mid to upper 50s here, but those 60s are usually much more prime conditions for severe. We had more of that yesterday, but in this setup, we're kind of scraping for parameters in this situation. So looking at instability, there's going to be plenty of that. We're going to be easily sitting in the 2000s. There could be a few 3000s in here over towards Colorado, Wyoming. Marginal severe threat, and then of course the hail analogs are going to be probably the big story of this one, especially towards the northern end of this slight risk. Towards the southern end, and we're going to switch over. Yeah, one problem with me using the mouse, the so-called mouse pad on the laptop here is that's a little harder to control, so I apologize. But it's a pretty similar deal across the board here. Sitting at about 3,000 joules in a couple of spots. This little pocket is developed here, which I find kind of interesting. And here's that torus sounding. Again, it's pretty similar to what we were looking at a little earlier. Slightly different on the D-cape, but overall, a little bit more ideal. Nonetheless, still dangerous conditions are possible. So now we're going to shift this over towards central Texas, towards Texas and New Mexico here. Then we'll go on from that point.